Hey, we can go ahead and get started now. My name's Amanda Pasik. I am Associate Director for Digital Marketing at Selby Gardens, and I'm here to present John McCarthy, Vice President for Regional History. He's going to be giving a presentation today, Treasures of the Historic Spanish Point Campus, Gems and Jewels. So take it away, John.
Thanks so much, Amanda. I appreciate it. It's been a fun spring this year. We've focused on the historic Spanish Point campus with this series of the treasures. And last year, of course, with Marie Selby Botanical Gardens' 50th anniversary, we focused on the downtown campus and how that all came to be. And this year, we've focused more on the Spanish Point campus. So we've explored the Guptill House and the Packing House and Mary's Chapel and the White Cottage. And those are all jewels and gems. I mean, let's face it, both our downtown Sarasota campus as well as our historic Spanish Point campus are real jewels in the community. And to wrap up this series with the program today, I wanted to catch some of the items that we had not talked about that are very important at that campus and to what we do as an organization. And so we titled it Gems and Jewels to focus on those. And as we get started, I want to thank Jennifer Romanecki, our president and CEO of Marie Selby Botanical Gardens, for making it possible for me to do these programs and share them with you. I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. As I say, last year, Marie Selby Gardens celebrated 50-year anniversary. And Spanish Point campus is celebrating a bit of a 50th anniversary this year as well. And that was we were placed on the National Register of Historic Places. So this is a little certificate that we were presented. And the name of the site at the time was the Osprey Archaeological and Historic Site. We've recently received quite a bit of coverage on this because this is very important. The first National Register site designated in Sarasota County was the historic Spanish Point campus, and that set the stage for many other National Register nominations and listings here in the Sarasota area. We always use images from many different sources to put these programs together. In this particular case, Wikimedia Commons came in handy for some ancient stuff. Art Institute of Chicago came in handy. Newspaper Archive, and Manatee County Library's photo collection. I'd like to take the time today to thank 4 volunteers who've helped me do all these presentations. Peg Kapustiak, Marlene O'Neill, Heather Bell, and Susan Lowy. They're always doing research, finding photographs for me and other items, and I really could not do the series without them. So they're the people behind the scenes kind of powering me up with all the things that I need to share with you. All right, so what are the gems and jewels we're going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the Palmer Aqueduct, something that's a little bit hidden, but huge, really, when you think about it in terms of landscape design and the garden. We're going to talk about Window to the Past, which is a very unique archaeological exhibit, and we're going to talk about some individual garden gems. So first, we'll get started with the Palmer Aqueduct and the Shell Cascade. One of the things that I find interesting is that we do not have a single historic photograph that depicts the aqueduct, but we do have these somewhat romantic artworks. And so this is a little pen and ink sketch that was done for Gordon Palmer for a brochure that he used to promote the tours that he was doing of the Bertha Palmer estate. And this was penned back in published back in 1958. And it shows the aqueduct as the arches cross over the low wetland area. It shows some of the beautiful urns that were there at the staircase. And it shows the magnificent live oak trees, in this case, kind of perched out over the aqueduct, right as the Jungle Walk Trail goes right through this area. And then this artwork by local artist Robert Chase, who did this watercolor image. He did a series of them for Ford Times magazine and featured all these images here at the Oaks property, as it was called at the time here in Osprey. And this is just a wonderful romantic image of the aqueduct with colorful vines and the shady live oak trees and showing those arches as it crosses over the low areas on its way down to the Shell Cascade. So the aqueduct was envisioned by Bertha Palmer back in 1911 and 1912 as she was designing her gardens there for what was going to become her country estate that she called Osprey Point on the old Webb homestead. And she was certainly inspired by the Roman aqueducts that she had seen in Europe. And here you see a typical Roman aqueduct these run along the edge of hills and mountains and then span valleys and rivers and creeks and things like that. So you always have a combination of a portion of the aqueduct that's just anchored on the ground, and then you have a portion that crosses over the low place with arches and things like that. This one's actually in England, but of course it was from the Roman Empire. And then one of the best preserved aqueduct in Europe is this one in the south of France. And you can see that this is elevated substantially with a series of arches to make this very, very strong river crossing in this particular case for the water flow. And I should say that not only were aqueducts used to move water in Europe, but also in southern North America, in Mexico, in Central America. The Mayans created aqueducts, the Inca created aqueducts. And so this is a kind of a global phenomenon as a way to move water around. Another aspect of European garden design was to create a grotto effect, a little cave, if you will, and these little pools and these little splash areas where water is splashing down like an artificial waterfall. And so I think those of you that are familiar with the aqueduct and the Shell Cascade kind of know why I'm showing you this ancient image from a garden in the Vatican in Italy. But let's take a look at what the aqueduct looks like today, because it all starts kind of when you're halfway between the Butterfly House and the Guptill House. And there's an area there where there's an old steel water tank. And then there's also the original artesian well, which we're seeing here. We see the capped off artesian well. Bertha Palmer had this installed in 1912. The well drillers went down 400 feet. It was a 6-inch diameter well, and it had artesian pressure, which meant that it already had its own head pressure and the water would just come freely flowing out. But they did create an elevated water tank, and they used a water ram or a pump to put the water up in the tank and then distribute it elsewhere. But one of the things that the artesian well fed was the aqueduct. And so this is the very beginning of the aqueduct that we see here as it's kind of going on down toward the pathway there. And then here's another shot of the aqueduct as it's heading down toward the Guptill House. It's about a foot wide in the center, and the concrete's about 20 inches wide in total. And in this particular case, it's perched up on the Indian mound, and it's using the slope and the elevation of the mound to slope very slightly as it goes on down its way. And then this is the entrance to the Fern Walk, which is a little circular garden behind the Guptill House. And so it spans the Fern Walk entry at this point with this concrete arch, again, very typical of Roman aqueducts. And then here we are behind the Guptill House, kind of heading down to run parallel with the Jungle Walk, which is the trail that led you from Bertha Palmer's home, the Oaks, through after Blue Garden and up through the woods, so to speak, or the jungle to get up to what she called Hill Cottage, which was what we call the Guptill House. And I should point out that putting an aqueduct into a garden is very much a part of the Edwardian garden philosophy that Bertha Palmer was inspired by in developing her series of gardens on the property. And that involved formal gardens connected by naturalistic trails and all sorts of cool features. So certainly the aqueduct is a cool feature, an artificial brook, if you will, paralleling the Jungle Walk. And one of the aspects of Edwardian landscape architecture was to utilize materials from the property, from the very earth itself, from the site. And you can see the scallop shells from the Indian shell mound embedded into sections of the aqueduct as it flows on down the way. Now, if you look real close in the center, you can see one of two little stepping stones where there's a little bit of a raised platform where you could walk over the aqueduct. And this was to lead you down into the Fern Walk Garden and then back up from the Fern Walk Garden. So there are two of these. They're both behind the Guptill House. The next time you're there, you can take a look and you can see them. And then here we're down kind of at the end, getting down toward the north end of Jungle Walk. And this is where the aqueduct curves in front of us here, goes underneath the little steps, and then pops back out on the left-hand side where we actually have the Roman arches supporting it over this low wetland area. These are kind of at the bottom of those steps looking back up. And again, in Edwardian garden fashion, if you look close, and in particular the next time you're on the campus, the steps have a concrete finish, but they're made out of the native bog iron that comes up out of the ground here. And so they use those materials from the site to build these steps. And then these are identical urns. They're reproductions. We'll talk about that more later, but these are identical to the ones that appear in that old 1958 sketch that I just showed a couple minutes ago. And then here's a slightly better view of the Roman arches as the aqueduct is continuing to go slightly downhill to meet the shell cascade and what was called for years the clamshell pool. And so here we are at the shell cascade, and we are also right at the southern edge of the Blue Garden, which was a formal French-inspired garden that Bertha said was her favorite garden, and that was directly adjacent to her home, the Oaks. And so the Blue Garden was 100 feet square, and it had these concrete curbings. These are the original concrete curbings from 1912. And then you go from this very formal French garden to this very rustic Italian grotto, if you will, a miniature version of that image that I showed you earlier from the Vatican. And you see how, again, the lightning whelks and the scallops and the clam shells and other shell material from the mound has been incorporated into this. And so here's what it looks like with the aqueduct feeding it, the little arch across the top, and then all these lightning whelks and scallops and clams. And I'll tell you, if you research Bertha Palmer and how much thought she put into all of her gardens and how hands-on she was, I could imagine her literally sitting here and either putting those shells into the wet mortar or specifically directing someone exactly how she wanted it done. And you can see, again, bog iron is the stones that you see across the top and then down along kind of the shoulders and the edges. And so, again, if you now look at this little tiny grotto pool shell cascade, and then you compare it to the image that I showed you, you can see where possibly Bertha Palmer's inspiration came from. And so I think it's always fascinating when you can find these ancient examples and then you see someone putting that into play in what was a very modern garden at the time. In fact, her utilization of the Edwardian garden principles, that was all brand new. And although now they would call that an old English garden, it was very innovative for the time. So this is a map that you may have seen before if you've watched one of my programs, Bertha Palmer's Love of Gardens. It's up on the YouTube channel. But here you can see the Blue Garden in blue at the top. And you can see the aqueduct also in blue as it winds its way down along the jungle walk behind the Guptill house and then down back up to the well itself. Or I should say it starts here at the well and it flows down over the arch behind Guptill house alongside Jungle Walk and then terminating here at the Shell Cascade. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the original water tank. So the footprint of these brick piers is still there today underneath the steel tank that Gordon Palmer installed in 1947 to replace this elevated tank. He put a pressure tank in. This was a cypress tank, very typical of Florida cisterns, but elevated so high so that it would create the gravity needed to flow the water all over the mound and throughout the entire property. So let's take another look at a map. So this is actually a survey that was done of the aqueduct in the early 1980s. But it's a great way for us to kind of look at all the different parts because the aqueduct seems small, but it's 600 feet long. It's actually one of the largest garden features at the Spanish Point campus, and yet we don't think about it that way. So maybe after today we will. So here again, you've got the 1912 artesian well, 400 feet down, 6 inches in diameter. Next to it's the elevated tank. And then the aqueduct kind of curves around, and then it has, this is where the arch is, where you can walk underneath the arch to go down into the Fern Walk. Here's the Guptill house. If you can see my cursor here, the little 2 short green arrows are where the little stepstones are, the little bridges, if you will, that take you over the aqueduct. And then as you come up in the middle section here, you've got the Jungle Walk parallel off to the side. So the way we currently run this, we have a water supply down at the end that feeds the Shell Cascade. But originally, the water would have been rushing down the entire aqueduct. So all along, walking down the jungle walk, you would have maybe heard a little bit of that water just gurgling on down, and you would have smelled the water and that sort of thing. And then here we have the stairs that go down into the low wetland area as we're approaching the Shell Cascade and Blue Garden up here at the top. So again, like most aqueducts, when they travel along the hillside, they're just right on the ground. When they have to go over the valleys or the wetlands or the rivers, they use the arches. So we've got the arches up here. Well, these are some photographs of the aqueduct after it had been neglected for about 25 years. Everything had grown up around it. This is down where the arches are in the low wetland. You see the sansevieria growing there. You see large oak tree, probably the same oak tree that appeared in that little romantic pen and ink sketch that Gordon Palmer had commissioned for his brochure. And that oak tree unfortunately fell on the aqueduct and did quite a bit of damage to it. These are some color snapshots from the early 1980s. You see a school group out here checking out where the first arch is. This is the arch down to the fern walk. And then you can see just how everything was just grown over. Brazilian peppers, other exotics. The sansevieria is growing in the aqueduct, like that's a pot for it. Here are the arches down toward the Shell Cascade, and they were in really poor condition. Here's the Shell Cascade, which is almost unrecognizable, really, in the upper right-hand side. And that's Marian Almy. She was an archaeologist who was one of the first people to really study the Shell Cascade and the aqueduct, to dig into the history and document that. She worked with George Lure, who was one of the sons of Carlisle Lure, who was one of the founders of Selby Gardens. And these are two sketches that George made back in 1989, showing a frontal view of the Shell Cascade, how the rocks were lined up, how the shells were placed. And then the one on the right-hand side is a top view looking down at it. And they didn't do a lot of work in the little pool itself, which is this central area. But they did find a couple of rocks and bricks down here and a pipe going into it. And they began to wonder about why some of the rocks and bricks were down there. Some of them had simply come loose, but it looked like others were maybe there to support something else. And then also on the sketch here, you see the curbing for the Blue Garden, which again is still in place, all original from 1912. And all of this was constructed, we believe, in 1912. So here is an expanded view of that survey that I showed you earlier. This was done by Shepherd and Associates architects. Herschel Shepherd had been a consultant and an advisor to a lot of the restoration taking place at the Spanish Point campus and the master plan for how the various historical elements could be restored. And so this simply shows more detail, shows where certain damages had occurred, like a piece here that's all broken and completely missing up in the upper left-hand corner. And this is just a very detailed survey, documented the steps as well that we see here kind of on the upper right-hand side, and then also documented the crossings down in the lower right-hand side, how these little stepstones were placed, shows the steel water, really the iron water tank, the old pump house, which is still there. We believe that's from the 1920s. And then the base of the artesian well itself, and then everything flowing out from that. Now, this is interesting because these are elevation views of the aqueduct. And so this is starting up at the upper left-hand corner at the Shell Cascade. And then, of course, working over the wetland with the arches. You see the broken arch where the tree had fallen and collapsed it. And then here we're up at the top of the mound. You see the elevations all the way down the mound. Here, toward the lower right hand, you see the arch down to Fern Walk, and then all the way up to and even including the little pump house there. So that's a very detailed, very important to have the elevations, because with the idea of restoring it, you wanted the water to be able to flow. So it needed to be a constant, very, very shallow slope downhill. And then this is simply from the other side, if you will, the opposite elevations. And so we're seeing everything that we saw in the last image but we're seeing the other side of it. And so very, very good documentation work that was done. Now, these are some photographs that also document some aspects. So upper right-hand corner are the little stepstones that go above. But one of the things that I've always been fascinated with are the scuppers that are along the aqueduct as it goes along the mound, and these kind of dump into fern walk garden and other little garden areas. And if you look at them today, they're just kind of smooth concrete. You can see the little holes that went there. But these photographs from the 1980s, if you look at the one in the upper left-hand corner, they actually found where there were little slots, where there are little sheet metal sluice gates that could be put into these scuppers to close them off if you just wanted to flow water down the aqueduct, or you could adjust them up if you wanted to flow water down into the fern walk garden or other garden areas. So this is something that I had really never noticed before until I looked back at some of the early reports that were done. And I think it's fascinating that they had the sophistication to put these little sluice ways in there to water the garden with the aqueduct. And then these are photographs that give you an understanding of the condition of things back in the 1980s. And I think that, a lot of times people come to our campuses and they don't realize how much effort's been put into restoring the Selby House or restoring the Payne Mansion and maintaining the historic trees and things like that. And the same occurred at Spanish Point, where a tremendous amount of effort was put into restoring those treasures of the campus. And I mean, my gosh, you talk about 25 years worth of neglect. Here's a Brazilian pepper tree rooted in the middle of the aqueduct. And you can see it on the left, you can see it on the right. And this was right behind the Guptill house. And by the time they got that out of there, they found, the concrete had broken. That allowed the roots to go down. And so that all had to be repaired. And then this is an early meeting out there, 1988. That's Pat Ball, contractor, in the middle there, pointing out some issues there where part of the aqueduct was partially collapsed. And then also on the left-hand side, you can see the steps coming down into the wetland area there. Those are the ones made out of the bog iron. And you don't see any urns there at that point because the urns had gone missing and they had to be replaced later. This is some of the work that Ball Construction did there, restoring kind of the second set of stairs. This is down leading into Blue Garden, leading you down into the lowest platform where then you walk around the corner to see the Shell Cascade. And you see how the steps had cracked and had come apart. Those were restored. The square urn bases were restored, and other work was done here to shore up all that 1912 concrete. They hired Rebecca Spain Swartz to do archaeological work and documentation work. She, again, associated with Herschel Shepard, the architect that had helped with a lot of the work at Spanish Point. So she started drawing very detailed sketches. The top one kind of shows the Shell Cascade on the far right, and then the Roman arches on the left. And then the lower one shows another section. And then she also, as George Luer had done earlier, working with Marian Almy from an archaeological standpoint, she also was documenting where all the shells were located, how the rocks were located, and did these wonderful sketches, which are nice to have because, frankly, we've lost some of the shells and we need to mortar some shells back up in place. Here she actually shows the top view of the pool itself, the rocks that surround it. Again, the little arch forming part of the grotto there. And then she also shows the depth of the pool itself in relationship to the Blue Garden curbing. And then here we have another one of her sketches, again, all in an effort to document what was there for restoration and historic preservation purposes. A little closer up view of how this is a side view now of the aqueduct coming in up here and splashing the water down the Shell Cascade. And again, on the far left, the curbing from the Blue Garden. So just a few other shots. This is from some work that Becky helped do. And of course, a lot of people were involved in it, but photographs kind of before and after, getting things cleaned up. Here's one looking down into the clamshell pool where they found these bricks, and they started thinking that maybe There was an actual clamshell down there at one point, and it was funny. There was no documentation ever of a clamshell. Nobody ever talked about a clamshell. Nobody remembered ever seeing a clamshell. But actually, at one point, somebody put a little clamshell down in there. Um, and it's interesting that the archaeological work on the aqueduct was actually published by Lauren Archibald, and she published it in the Florida Anthropologist. And so with the sketch and basically describing how they had done the work to understand all the details of the aqueduct. And these are images, actually, were Becky's images that were published in that report. But Florida Anthropologist generally deals with items related to Native American history, but this was an example of another type of history being published. And then this is another report that was done by John Maceman, who ran a company called the South Florida Conservation Center. And John helped us with work as well and documented it in these photographs in this little report that he did up. So here you see the steps coming down into the low wetland area. And that's a big change from some of those photos we were looking at just a couple minutes ago. And then here he documented the repair of the collapsed arch. This was actually repaired twice. They did cosmetic repair, and then they went back in and did a complete repair of it because the first repair didn't hold up too well. There was just too much weight on the arches. And so in these two images, if you look on the left, you can see one of the sections has collapsed, and then here on the right, you see it's all been replaced. Here's the work of taking out some of the repair material that had been put in. And then you see all the dust here in the air from concrete cutting through this one section of the aqueduct because it was determined that it just needed to be replaced in its entirety. So the wood forms were made up. And if you look carefully at the wood forms in the lower right-hand side, you can see how they built in the indentations that would need to be impressed into the side of the panels when they poured the concrete. So they really had to think this through. I think it's fascinating that they added shells into the new piece of concrete, just like in the original aqueduct. They went to that effort to put the shells in there. And then if you look at the caption on this photograph to the right, application of yogurt. So John Maceman said that if you applied yogurt to the concrete, it would make it age. It would make it look like the other concrete that was there because it would grow, a little mold on it or something like that. So I just think it's fascinating how yogurt becomes a part of a historic preservation project of a concrete aqueduct. And here there were areas where since 1912, there had been erosion of the surfaces. So they were able to treat some of that and clean it up and make it look nicer, which you see filling the voids in the concrete here on the right-hand side. And then a wonderful photograph of this completely new arch. And interestingly enough, they did all the recessed design of it on the side that you see. But if you go around to the back side, they didn't go to the effort to do that. And it's the same way on the original aqueduct as well. And then another image of the Shell Cascade. And I don't know if you can hear this or not, but the water is coming on down into the pool. And so these water features were parts of gardens because it introduced the calmness of trickling water. It introduced motion. It introduced excitement to the garden setting. So just to recap on the aqueduct, Janet Snyder Matthews, who had done the National Register nomination for Historic Spanish Point and had done tremendous research on the area, she had done a report about the aqueduct. The surveyors came in, David Kellogg working for Bishop and Associates to do actual surveying. And then Rebecca Spain at the time, later Rebecca Spain Swartz, worked with Daniel Delahaye, another architect, to do those field measurements and the sketches that we saw. And then there was a decision made that they were going to repair some of the materials of the aqueduct at the same time that they were restoring the pergola over at the Sunken Garden, but they didn't have enough money and resources to do it all. So they created a phase two, which they estimated to be about $37,000. And that was what we saw where they replaced the entire section of the collapsed aqueduct. And so here again, we've got later 1989, more archaeology and more detailed work. And then additional documentation by George Luer and Lauren Archibald, which then led to that publication in the Florida Anthropologist. And then, another study in 1993 with more detailed work all of it kind of putting us in a good position to be able to continue to maintain the aqueduct in as close as possible to its original condition over time. So with that, I think we'll pause and see if Amanda has any questions for us, and then we're going to move on to another section of our program.
All right. Yeah, we do have some questions. Do you know of any other historic garden aqueducts in the Sarasota area?
Well, Amanda, I've been thinking about that a lot recently, and I can't think of any. I mean, I did a program for Selby a while back called the Gardens of the Sarasota Area, and I kind of dove into every garden I could find. I see nothing else like this. This was very unique for our region, and I'm sure people that saw it just were taken by it because nobody had ever seen anything like it before.
Great. How does the aqueduct work now, since you said the old artesian wall is plugged?
Yeah, so the Water Management District really frowns upon continuing to use these old artesian wells because they're so deep and they're concerned about erosion of the piping itself. And so that was capped off, filled with concrete, if you will. But we have another irrigation well on the property. And so what we do is we run that in plumbing down to a location not far from the steps that go down into the wetland. And there is an electric eye there, which when people walk by, it triggers the pump and the water goes down. And by the time people walk down to the shell cascade, it's splish splashing a little water down there. And then it turns itself off automatically. So that's how it works now. And it works pretty good.
Great. And then I think we just have one more. Was the aqueduct the only reason for the original well?
Well, that well served it served really the whole property. There was a lot of flow of water there, so it served the Hill Cottage, what we call the Gupta House. It served White Cottage. It served irrigation over the entire site. It also provided water to her house, the Oaks, north of where the campus is today. So the aqueduct was just one of the ways that that water was put to use, and there was plenty of water available. That is a large capacity well.
All right, great. So I think that was it for now.
Okay, well, let's get into our second section, which is Window to the Past. One of the most unique archaeological displays or exhibits anywhere. And this is what it looks like from the outside. It's got the sign there, doors welcoming you in. And when you go inside, you're literally immersed in the shell mound. And it's because of this hole that was dug back in the 1890s that we have an opportunity to have the only location where you can walk inside a shell mound in Florida and see what it looks like when you're looking at 1,000 years of history in front of you. And so these are some of the exhibits there that talk about the archaeology. And this isn't just talking about archaeology. These are actually photographs from the work that took place at the site at Windows. But it's really cool. This is actually looking at the shell on this one profile where you have layers of scallops and oysters and whelks and conchs and virtually every kind of shell that you could find in Little Sarasota Bay is in this mound, along with fish bone, pottery samples, shell tools, shark's teeth, fish vertebra. Everything that was part of the life of the Native Americans that lived here is embodied within the layers here. And then there are various exhibits inside. Of course, this is a mural that's up high. I love this mural because it kind of shows it before the mound was built up completely. I mean, it took, 1,000 years or so to build this mound up the way it is today, what we call the point. But this kind of shows it, it's like a little sandbar, a little oyster bar. People began camping there. They deposited the shells. They began to realize that by making the shells up higher, they could get above the high tides, the storm tides, the hurricanes, better breeze, fewer bugs, better view, all sorts of reasons to build up. But I really like that mural. And then there's a little 3D little topographic map, if you will, that shows the shell ridge, to try to explain to people that everything that you're walking on when you're at White Cottage and Sunken Garden and Pergola and the White Cottage lawn, that's all man-made. That hill along the water is not natural. It is all man-made. And then you also can see archaic shell ring, much older than the shell ridge, but that's where the Gupta house is. So I think that's a cool little thing. And then very important to kind of compare what was going on here with what was going on in other places of the world. It gives people, our visitors, a chance to kind of put it into a context, and they're always fascinated by how ancient these mounds are because the mounds at the historic Spanish Point campus are as old as the Great Pyramids of Giza. And when people think of archaeology, they think of the Great Pyramids. Well, think of historic Spanish Point. And then a lot of educational exhibits were put in for the children as well as adults. And this one's kind of like everyday objects then and now. It's a great little contrast between a stainless steel spoon and a clamshell spoon, or a plastic Tupperware versus a pottery vessel to hold food in. And most people, when they think about how Window to the Past came about, they talk about that it was a carport. It was a garage for a guy to park his car. And while that was true in the 1920s, that's not how the whole got there. And I just wanted to kind of today, once and for all, get it out there. This is the handwriting of Charles Webb. He was John Webb's grandson. In 1969, he sat down, he started writing down all his memories. And in this case, he talks about this example where Norman Spang, who was one of the visitors to the Webb's Winter Resort, he was very wealthy. He was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, friends with Carnegie. He comes down and he becomes one of the first visitors at the resort, ends up buying a little bit of property from John Webb just beyond the homestead house. And in this particular handwritten story, Charles Webb describes how that Spang wanted to drill a well, and he drilled the well from the top of the mound, but the water wouldn't go to the top of the pipe. It didn't have enough artesian pressure to get all the way up to the top of the Indian Mound. So instead, they excavated a hole about 12 feet by 25 feet and 15 feet deep. The pipe was cut off then, and the artesian well flowed freely. Later on, Spang had father, that would have been William Webb, John Webb's son, build him a tower, a tank tower, and he put in 1,000-gallon tank and a hydraulic ram to get the water up there so he could have water. And he goes on to talk about this, and he says, I felt that this story should be written as it was quite a factor in my early boyhood. He also talks about all the shell and soil that they took out of the hole. They sifted, created a garden, and they grew tomatoes and asparagus, and it was a wonderful garden. So this is how the hole got there in the first place. This was 1890s, and this is the origin of the pit in the ground. Now, just to put this in perspective, this is a photograph that probably none of you've ever seen before. This is on the north side of the Shell Ridge. This is the old original homestead house. So the sunken garden and pergola would be to our left here, out of the image. This little sandy beach area is where all the mangroves are now that you walk through to get out to the footbridge. And this is the Spang water tower, which could have been built right over the pit in the ground, or it might have been put off to the side. But he had to have a little power plant to run the water ram. And I think that this could have been built directly over the pit. And then you see his house further out, which would have been out probably right where the turnaround is at the end of the road out by Point Cottage today. And you see one of the Webb's north side dock, if you will, going out into the bay. And we actually were able to find some of these pilings out in the mangroves that are still there. But anyway, that's kind of the origin of the whole. But the origin of the archaeological exhibit really started back in the early 1980s when the original master plan for the property was conceived. They knew the hole was there and they thought it would make a good exhibit. But in 1990, things really got exciting and a committee came together. And this included Marion Almy, who was a local archaeologist, Pat Ball, who was a contractor, Steve Latman, who was associated with Raymar Development on the board of Spanish Point, and George Lure, archaeologist. And so these are the agenda for their very first meeting in July of 1990 to talk about creating what we now know as Window to the Past. This is kind of a little position statement, if you will, what they wanted to achieve through that and how they were going to go about doing it. They got a grant from the state historic preservation grant, as well as grants from the Selby Foundation. And so that's what funded it. They engaged with a company called Wilderness Graphics that does a lot of signs and museum exhibits. And they started to think about what kind of a structure could they build there that would lend itself to doing the exhibits that they had in mind. And this is one of the first artistic renderings created by Wilderness Graphics. In this case, they were looking at just a simple flat roof Looks like they were actually looking at maybe a steel roof with all those little angles. But they were showing, as it is today, the profiles of the mound on the left-hand side behind glass, and then exhibits on the right-hand side, which is pretty much how it turned out. This is how you did project planning back in the 1990s before you had fancy software. You just typed it up and you made your calendar. And so you can see that they were very thoughtful about what needed to get done, because you're not only building a structure, but you're doing archaeology simultaneously. And simultaneous with that, you're designing exhibits which are reflecting what you're discovering in the archaeology. So it was very important for all of this to be coordinated. These are other sketches done by Wilderness Graphics, which began to kind of hone in on what we know today as window to the past, with the double doors coming in up here, upper left, the little diorama of the little Native American house here, and then exhibit panels along the wall on the west side, and then the glass with the focus on the shell mound on the on the east side. This is a later rendering as the architectural plans moved forward. They began to look at a pitched roof. But again, the same idea. In this particular case, it's showing us glass all the way around with exhibits on the far wall. And of course, a dugout canoe hanging from the ceiling and steps going up. But some of those elements were not incorporated, obviously. A little model was made, and you see how they made the model. It's a little hard to see because of the contrast, but they did the contours of the mound because they had to kind of figure out, how do you build this building that's enclosing a hole in the mound, but it's got to be on top of the mound. And the roof is almost level with the mound. It's kind of interesting when you're down there. These are the plans. They were done by ADP, which was an architect here in Sarasota, architects, designers, planners. And you see Archaeological Consultants, which was the company owned by Marion Almy. They did the archaeology, oversaw that part of it. Ball Construction did the work. Wilderness Graphics did the design, and Griffith Engineering took care of all the little structural engineering. These are more detailed plans, again, showing the contour of the mound and the contour of the old pit that was dug by Spang back there in the 1890s, and showing they put concrete columns in, they poured them in place. They tried to do the most minimal disruption to the mound as possible as this was going forward. Now, I thought it would be good to see what it looked like before. And this is the best photograph I could find on the left-hand side. This is kind of the way it was when I first saw it back in 1979. This is Marion Almy here on the left, George Lure, Pat Ball. I don't know who these folks are on the right-hand side. Over here on the left is they're just getting started with the work. They've got their permit sign here, and they've got some survey markers in, and they've cleaned out the vines and things like that. So this is basically what it looked like before all the work was done. Here they're celebrating. This is Linda Mansberger. She was the executive director at the time, and Steve Latman, who was the president of the board when this project moved forward. And I apologize, I don't know the names of the two women on the sides, but we might see their names later, but I don't know which is which. This is a nice photograph when the work was taking place. I know in other programs this spring, I've been incorporating construction photos because I think they're interesting to see things in progress. And so here's an example of that. And then the archaeology, like I said, the archaeology had to take place at the same time that the work was getting done. And August of 91 was a big month. And hey, this is how we signed up volunteers back in the day. You had a clipboard with a piece of paper on it and wrote people's names in there. We had some awesome volunteers come up from the Randall Research Center down in Pineland on Pine Island down in Charlotte Harbor. And they were working under Bill Marquardt out of the University of Florida. And so they came up and helped out, which was a real bonus. But also, this was when Time Sifters Archaeological Society here in Sarasota was just getting started. And this gave a real hands-on project for the Time Sifters members to come and engage and participate in creating this window to the past. And here are some nice photographs that made the local media. This is Corbett Torrance, who was one of the archaeologists working with Bill Marquardt down at the Randall Research Center. And then Jerry Warren, who's working as his assistant. And they're doing the detail work on the profile, cleaning it all up, looking for opportunities to be able to showcase different features and things like that. And then this photograph of one of the shell woodworking tools demonstrated there. All of a sudden, we started getting a lot more publicity. And so this is an article out of the Herald Tribune talking about, this exhibit depicts life in ancient Florida. And then this is one by Joan Altaby. Joan was the art critic for the Herald Tribune. And I find it interesting. I love her title, Sympathetic Shelter Protects Indian Mid. And so anyway, this is pretty cool stuff. And this is the Spanish Point newsletter. It was called The Vision. And this is, looking forward to the grand opening that was scheduled to be held in January of 1992. This is the invitation for the grand opening. And I apologize, it's so light. Whatever ink they used on it faded away. So we saved a copy of it, but it's hard to read. And then press release went out January 1st, leading up to. You see the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation made us front page news on their monthly newsletter. Spanish Point makes history. Pretty cool. Here's the Gainesville Sun. They saw it as significant enough to come down and cover it as well. And Randall Research Center, this is out of their newsletter, talking about how they contributed to it and some of the reports that were done. And then this is from the Inglewood Sun, showing some of the features, the entrance, some of the fish vertebra that you can see if you know where they are in the mound. And then Linda down there in front of the sunken garden and pergola. And then this is kind of photographs from the big party when it opened. And I think it's notable to mention a couple of these people. We had Senator Bob Johnson there in the upper left-hand corner. He was a big supporter. Anne Marie Hill was one of the county commissioners down here. You had Jan Matthews down here in the lower right-hand corner who'd done all the historical research for the National Register nomination and everything else on the site. Dr. Perkins, Bob Perkins, who was the president of the William G. and Marie Selby Foundation at the time. And then our own Pat Ball contractor up here with the dark glasses and sports jacket. So that was the happenings. And then I should also mention that, this all took place and wrapped up in 1992. And in 2005, some new exhibits were added, updating the exhibit a little bit and bringing more life to it. And again, very, very rare and unique opportunity to share what a mound is all about with our guests. And three archaeological reports, scientific peer-reviewed reports came out of this. They were all published in this one particular issue of the Florida Anthropologist in December of 1998. The first one was Laura Kozak, and she focused on the evidence of shark being consumed by the Native Americans here. So she did a very detailed analysis of shark vertebra, other components of sharks, to be able to study that aspect. Irving Quitmeyer was interested in the seasonality of the harvest of the shell. And in this particular study, they talk about how you can tell when the shell was harvested by its growth rings and how the shell develops in its life cycle. So you can tell that there was a lot of consumption, for instance, in the summertime of the scallops and things like that. And also, I'm glad I found this because it's a nice profile of what you see in Window to the Past. This profile is what you see there today. And you can see there's a little valley that comes down through here, and that existed back then as well, although it has eroded a little bit since then. And then this study by Lee Newsom, which dealt with seeds and charcoal that was recovered from the site when they were working on it. And so this lists all sorts of things like the mangroves and the oak trees and pine trees and all sorts of other plants that were growing on the property back in ancient times, documented through this work. So this effort to create this exhibition actually resulted in a lot of scientific knowledge gained. And then just to summarize, as we wrap up this section, people began living in the Shell Ridge 2,500 years ago. 1896, we believe Spang dug the well and created it. The 1970s was when Jan Matthews did the research to get it on the National Register. Property was donated in 1980, and then the hole was identified as an opportunity. First advisory board meeting, we were looking at the agenda. They came in and cleaned and mapped the hole. They did the preliminary design, got the building permit submitted. Volunteers, of course, did all the work in the summertime when it's hot. and then the grand opening in January and the enhancement of the displays. So that kind of wraps up Window to the Past. Now we're going to talk about some garden gems. So I want to start with this one because these are reproductions of the urns that were originally placed at the Jungle Walk, where it goes down into the wetland leading to the Shell Cascade. And there was one of these urns that had survived over the years, and Historic Spanish Point connected with an artist named Sean Colson. Sean made a mold of the one original and produced a whole series of these that were done as a fundraiser. And then these were placed there on site. So these are actual authentic scale reproductions of Bertha Palmer's urns that were here back in 1912. Then also, we're fortunate to have this little sculpture. It's called Boy with the Koi Fish. Boy with the Koi Fish is symbolic of prosperity and upward mobility. And this is actually on its original concrete base. It's a white metal casting. It's like a fake bronze, but it's on the original concrete base. It was originally in the center of the Blue Garden and was part of a fountain there. So in the background here, you see Bertha Palmer's home, the Oaks, as it was after she added to it and added to it and added to it and made it quite the palatial home. And on the left-hand corner, you can see the modern view of the Boy with the Fish. And so when the Oaks property was developed, the Boy with the Fish was given over so that it could be preserved as part of Historic Spanish Point. And we actually have a spare concrete base. We ended up with two concrete bases. And then this is a wonderful cast iron, porcelain enameled conservatory urn that is located in the middle of the fern garden. But it used to be, well, let's talk more about it. It's French. They think it's from the middle 19th century. It's in the style of 18th century French Rouen pottery. It's assembled from 6 different pieces of cast iron bolted together. Unfortunately, it's missing the lion heads that used to stick out from the side, but this was hand applied colors, and now it looks white and gray, but originally this would have been white and cobalt blue. And this has been outside so long that it has completely faded. By the way, there's an example of the pottery down below. This pottery, from the 1700s, they were replicating these early French styles in these conservatory urns. So this is one that I found online. This was sold by Finnegan Gallery out of Chicago. And so this one shows it with its blue color, and it shows it with the lion heads sticking out of the sides. And it also has the maker's name and location down here if you look at the lower right-hand corner. So it was made just outside of Paris and, obtained there perhaps by Bertha Palmer, shipped probably to Chicago, and then ultimately down to Osprey, Florida. Well, here it is in Blue Garden. So if you look in here, and it has a palm tree growing out of the top of it, you can see that when it was in Blue Garden, and this photograph is, I believe, from about 1946, you can see it still had the lion heads on it. We've got another view. Here again, the palm has been removed, but the lion head is still there. This is also Blue Garden. Again, this is now where the first house on the waterfront is, north of the Shell Cascade. And this is what we've been calling the Byzantine urn, but we're beginning to think this is Roman in origin. Most people think of this as concrete. It looks like concrete, but it could be stone. It has a number of animals depicted around it. That caused some people to think it was a zodiac. And then it has these odd handles that now, the more we looked at it, they appear to be cats. There are lions and birds and all sorts of animals on this. And this sits, just beyond the Welcome Center on your way down to White Cottage. Well, years ago, we found this photograph of Bertha's stone castle on Lakeshore Drive, and there's an urn that looks a lot like it. And but you're not going to be able to compare it from a postcard view like this. But look at this image. So here we basically see the urn in front of Bertha Palmer's stone castle on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. And then we see it at Spanish Point. This is in the 1940s. And so the question is, when did it arrive? Was it something that she brought down in 1912? We're beginning to think it might have come down later. We're beginning to think it might have come down, maybe Potter Palmer Jr. brought it down in the 1930s, or Gordon Palmer might have even brought it down in the late 1940s, because that's when this photograph was taken, and it's here. So anyway, pretty cool. And then Peg Kapustiak, she happened to be up in Chicago a week or so ago, and I teased her and I said, "Hey, Peg, go find another one of these." And she did. She found this one, which is a photograph of one that was owned by the next door neighbors to Bertha Palmer right there on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. They were just a little side street away from one another. And this one is very similar. It has the cat handles. It has the animals all over it, just like the one that we have. The difference being ours has interlocking circles at the top, and this has circles that interlock with diamonds. So this one's a little different, but they both came from Chicago. They were right next door to one another. And this was a great discovery that Peg made just a couple of days ago. So, anyway, here I've got them side by side, ours down on the campus and the one that is up at Chicago at the neighbors. And then, so that kind of wraps up our Gems and Jewels program for today. And again, these were just a few of the gems and jewels, because the reality is that both our downtown Sarasota campus and our historic Spanish Point campus are filled with gems and jewels. And these are just a few of the things that I wasn't able to cover in the other programs this spring. And so we wanted to share it with everyone now as we wrap up the series of the treasures of the historic Spanish Point campus. And with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. And as we do that, I'd like to say that this summer in June, July, and August, I'm going to present a series of historical briefings that combine stories of old Sarasota and old Florida with food recipes. So I've never done anything like this before. So I think it'll be exciting. I think it'll be informative, and maybe it'll be delicious. So with that, Amanda, do we have any questions as we wrap up today?
Yeah, we just have a few. How long was the cut in the mound used as a car garage?
Oh, great. Because I didn't talk a lot about that. So this guy, Walter Conrad, ends up buying the end of the point from John Webb. And in the 1920s, he used it to park a car. And there's some suggestion that he actually put a roof over it, so he had quite the garage. He died, I think, in 1930. So I would imagine that he might have used it maybe 6 or 7 years, maybe 1923 on up through 1930, maybe even a shorter period of time. But because when they were creating Window to the Past, everybody said, well, we're taking this old car park and we're turning it into an archaeological exhibit. Nobody went back and saw the notes from Charles Webb saying, hey, this was dug to put in a well. So everybody thinks that Conrad dug the hole to park his car in it, but he just took advantage of the hole the same way that we did.
Um, are there any other places in Florida where you can go inside a mound like this?
So there used to be one on Fort Myers Beach, the Mound House, and they got inspired by Window to the Past, and they took an old swimming pool that was in an Indian mound, and they cut the end out of it and put glass in there. But unfortunately, the last two hurricane seasons have rendered that closed. So we were the first and the only until they did theirs, and now we're the only again. So hopefully they'll be able to get theirs up and running. It's a great way to share Florida history with visitors. But right now, if you want to see the inside of a shell mound, the only place you can do it is at Marie Selby Botanical Gardens.
Very cool. And how did we end up with all the urns?
How did we end up with all the urns? Well, it was a very collaborative situation, I think, back when the Oaks was being developed, and that was kind of the part of the property where Bertha Palmer's house was and the home farm and everything kind of around us was being developed. As they found things, they contributed them to the historic Spanish Point. So I think that includes the French cast iron porcelain enamel conservatory urn that was in Blue Garden. They just kind of pushed it over on our side. The Boy and the Fish, the urn that was reproduced by Sean Colson. So the only one that I showed that was really anchored on the property was that Roman one with all the animals on it. So we were just very fortunate that everybody was pumped up about the history. There are some other urns and other ornamentation over on the private side of the Oaks Bay side. And so they've got some of it remaining over there as well. So it's not just what's on our side, but we got the good stuff.
All right, great. Well, I think that's all the questions that we have. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. And just want to let you know that this will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel. If you just search Selby Gardens, I can get that uploaded probably tomorrow morning.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And thanks to all of you for viewing, and tell your friends and point them to our YouTube channel. There's tons of good information there on our various videos, whether it's botany, whether it's art, whether it's history, it's all there. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Have a great day.